Segu, I'm Dale Montour. It's no secret that it was a policy of the federal government of Canada to assimilate Aboriginal peoples. The Indian Act and its discriminatory laws, enfranchisement, residential schools, and the White Paper, to name a few. A psychological warfare waged against Aboriginal people to lower their self-esteem to a point where they wouldn't want to be Indians anymore. On today's show, we're going to tell you another story about those assimilation tactics. It's sad, it's tragic and painful to listen to, but here is their story.
They had taken me away. She had left me during the week. She'd leave me on like a boarding home. This lady on the farm would keep different children, and she'd babysit them. And then on the weekend, because she was working in the bush, and then on the weekend she'd come pick me up. Well, supposedly during that particular week, they had taken me away from that family, the social services, and brought me back to the hospital in Hearst, and then decided to give me to Kapuskasing. Through my research, I found out that when my mom came back to pick me up, I wasn't there anymore. So she tried to search for me and came back to Cap and finally found me. But she was refused access to me. They said that she had left me alone, and she had no... she didn't care about her child.
And the more I look into my family as an Aboriginal person, the more I understand and come to realize that I come from generations of broken homes. And my mother, she went through residential school, and she's, golly, I mean, I'm still getting to know my mom, and I'll need to know how old she is. But for the sake of this interview, I'll say she's around 45-ish. And she's illiterate. She made it through residential school fine, but she's illiterate, so I'm just wondering what the motives were there. And I just think of where my mother came from and the circumstances that she grew up in. You know, the early 70s, had already lost 3 children, is now about to lose 3 more children. She couldn't read or write, or she could only get jobs in fish canneries. She resorted to alcohol to cope, and was really caught up in Valium and prescription drugs, and wasn't able to be a mom.
I was born out of wedlock, and so I guess in those days, a couple of things. One is, if you were a woman and you had a child out of wedlock, well, you were a scarlet woman, what kind of woman would do that kind of thing? And then secondly, if you were an Indian, I guess you were a double scarlet woman, red in 2 cases. And so, it was just felt that, she was not the kind of person who should be bringing a child up and stuff like that. So I assume now that, we're a little further along the path and that wouldn't happen, but that's my understanding of basically why it happened.
Their circumstances may have been different, but the result has always been the same. Native children suffering at the hands of the child welfare system, a system which is supposed to protect and benefit them. At one time, it was the residential schools located in many cases great distances from their homes. And then this approach to child welfare was replaced by one of taking large numbers of children from their families and placing them in non-Aboriginal foster homes. For many of these children, the result has been a lifelong search to heal and find their roots, and still others go through their whole lives without even knowing who they are. Diane Poirier is one of those people. Taken away as a baby and placed in a French family, she was told that her parents had died in a car accident. She knew she was different, and as she became older, the confusion about her identity became greater.
I was confused. I was very confused, and then my dad came over, and as I was growing up, Dad was the only one that protected me all the time against everything that was the upgrowing and being different, and he would protect me. And then he came into the bedroom and he said, Diane, I have to talk to you. And I said, no. I said, why? He said, I have to tell you the truth. And I thought, I don't know. I mean, you've already told me the truth, so I believe you. And he said, no, you have to know everything about yourself, of what we know. And I kind of knew within myself what he was going to say, but I wasn't ready to face it at that time. And he came up and started explaining to me that they had taken me away from my mom. We didn't get into that much detail at that point, but saying that my parents weren't dead, that my mother lived in the same town as I was living, and she knew me, but she was not allowed to come close to me. And he said that I probably, by that time I didn't want to hear anymore because I was being told lies, and it was like I believed in this, my father, who was my idol, believed in him, and I couldn't come to terms with the fact is why did they lie to me?
Jeanette August Martin is Nuu-chah-nulth from Vancouver Island. Her experience from a tiny baby to about 6 years old was living hell before she was apprehended permanently. But she says it wasn't her mother's fault. Her mother had been sent to residential schools and been abused, and so had her mother's mother.
And I would have to say, you know, in retrospect, for very valid reasons, my mother would leave us for days unattended, unsupervised. I would be 3 years old, changing my younger sister's diapers and trying to find them food and take care of them. And we would get taken away from my mother, and we would be sent back, and everything would be fine. There would be food in the cupboards, we'd have clothes to wear, we'd have toys to play with. And soon the pattern repeated itself. My mother would start drinking again, and we would be left unattended, and my mother was very abusive towards me. As a child, I experienced living in with my mother because we were unsupervised a lot. I was a victim of sexual abuse, and had I, you know, tried to confide in my mother, it was difficult to, because she came from a world where she was also sexually abused, and her mother didn't believe her.
Bill Lee is the director of the Anishinaabe Health Center in Toronto. He was lucky to have grown up with wonderful foster parents, but that's not to say he did not experience any racism or alienation.
I myself was fostered out when I was 2 weeks old, and I grew up thinking that I was a wasp. And so there was, it was quite an interesting experience when I was about 7. I mean, I didn't think of myself as being anything but white, and all my friends were white. The community I lived in Winnipeg, I mean, there were no people of color, so to speak. And I remember one day I was walking down the street with all my friends, and I was 7, and some other kids walked up, 4 or 5 other kids, and they went, "Oh, look at the dirty Indian." And so I turned around to look and see where the dirty Indian was, so I could call him names too. And then when I turned back after not being able to spot this dirty Indian, I saw all my little friends fighting with these guys. So my little friends were fighting with them because they had called me a dirty Indian, but I didn't. That was the very first time I can consciously remember coming to the realization that I wasn't the same as everybody else.
When it didn't go well in the family, naturally in the environment, in the French family, often they would, you know, speak really bad of Native people. You know, they say they were drunks, they didn't work, and they take, you know, the government was paying everything for them. To me, it was, how can they judge a community? I'm sure there's good people, like in any culture that you go in, you've got the good and the bad, and that's fine. That's so my younger sister and brother, well, naturally, when they get upset, well, they, you know, follow their footsteps, and they call me, you know, "Oh, you've been adopted. We should have left you in the country, you know, and why don't you go back to your savages?" And I was like, "Whew, okay." And I would cry and cry. "No, yeah, big crybaby. You know, you're lucky that we've taken you in." And for them, again, children are the worst ones to hurt you. But I'm sure they weren't saying those words unless they heard them.
I thought, I'm with white people now. My life is going to be great. Everything's going to be wonderful because I'm with white people now. And I was in grade 3. Any child tells me today that they were in grade 3, I can say, you're probably about 8 years old, right? Because in grade 3, I was sexually molested by my school teacher. And that's when I decided it was because I was Indian. All of this happened to me. You know, I'm living with white people now. It's not supposed to happen. It must be happening because I'm Indian. And so, in retrospect, I can see that what I did was denied anything that had to do with being Native, denied everything that had to do with being Native. And I tried so hard to be white, to just emulate the white in me, because everything horrible that happened to me as a kid was because I was Indian.
The people of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are entering into a new era of freedom of movement.
It was called the 60s scoop, where social workers would literally scoop children from their families on the slightest pretext. They sincerely felt that they were saving these children from the effects of crushing poverty, unsanitary health conditions, poor housing, and malnutrition, which were facts of life in many communities and in the cities. Unfortunately, the long-term effect of apprehension on the individual child was not considered, nor were the effects of apprehension on Indian families and communities taken into account, and some communities lost almost a generation of their children as a result.
The ratio of Native children who are taken out of their homes is very high. In Manitoba, at the time that I was removed from my mom, they were even taking Native children and sending them to Australia, to England, to Europe, to the United States, which I think was a crime. But again, in the Kenora Patricia area, at one time, I looked at the statistics of the Children's Aid Society there, and they had made, for example, 2,000 visits to white families, and they had apprehended 40 children, and they made, say, a similar number of visits to Native families, and they apprehended 800 children. And it was always, I said to myself, well, the bottom line is that most Native parents, like most non-Native parents, are caring and loving parents and want to do the best for their children. And I don't argue the point that there may be times when Native parents, like any other parents, for a number of reasons, may not be in a position to do what's right by their children, and maybe the children would be safer somewhere else. But I think a lot of the apprehensions come from a lack of understanding of the Native world.
And each one of these Aboriginal children had their own way of dealing with the racism, the alienation from their own culture, the sense of not knowing who they were. For many, it was rebellion, the use of alcohol and drugs, or a refusal to accept the Indian in them. Diane rebelled, and at a very young age became pregnant. But she says it was her way of dealing with the pain. Jeanette did everything she could to be accepted by her white peers, no matter what the cost.
And I got pregnant with my daughter. Well, I didn't have time to worry about my problems anymore. It was like, this was my child, and nobody could touch that one. That belonged to me, and I went through, I got kicked out of the house because I was pregnant. Again, I was ashamed to the family, so it didn't matter which way I went, I was always ashamed. So anyway, I thought, the hell, I don't care anymore, because this time, nobody's going to tell me how to do with my baby. So I went through my pregnancy. They wanted me to have an abortion. I refused to have an abortion. They wanted to send me to unwed mother home in Toronto. I refused, and I was determined. I was just so determined. That was my child, and nobody could take it away.
So I was 12 years old. I started smoking cigarettes, and then I started smoking a little pot with the friends in the park, and then I started drinking and started trying to fit in and wear the clothes my white buddies were wearing. Didn't know what the Indian people were doing this entire time. And dyed my hair blonde and red and orange and whatever color it would be other than my own.
For Diane, it's been a lifelong search for her roots. She has found her sister, her aunt, and finally her mother, has had the chance to meet her sister and her aunt. But sadly in the story, it is her mother who has been the ultimate victim. She herself was torn away from her mother and siblings, sent to various foster homes and orphanages. She gave birth out of wedlock twice, one child taken away from her, and the other one they told her had died at birth. So when Diane found out and tried to meet with her, it was just too much. But Diane never gives up hope.
So I gave her a call. I was already enthusiastic to speak to her and everything, but she didn't have too much to say. She first of all said, I know you, but she says, that other girl you're talking about is not my daughter. And I said, yes, she is. You gave birth to her and hers. And she said, no, they told me she passed away. And I said, well, she didn't. It's a lie. You know, it was a lie. So, I mean, she is alive and all that. And we just love to meet you. And she said, no, Diane. She says, what they've done to me, you'll never understand. And I said, yes, I think I do. She says, you know, when you take kittens away from the mother, and they never come back, that's what they've done with you. And I said, but anyway, she said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. I don't think I could handle all this. I said, okay, fine, we'll just leave it, and maybe one day, you know, I'll write to you, and maybe one day we'll meet.
Jeanette has been making some phone calls of her own and doing some of her own research to find her biological father.
I made a phone call March 6th in Ottawa. No, March 7th in Ottawa, March 6th in BC, because of the time difference. It was 12:30 at night. I pick up the phone and call the BC directory, get a phone number. As soon as the operator's giving me the phone number, I hang up and I dial the phone number. And the gentleman on the other end answers the phone. And this is how I sum up the initial part of our conversation. It goes like this. Good evening, is Robert Plum there? Yes, speaking. Good evening, Robert. My name's Jeanette August Martin. I'm calling from Ottawa. I'm a voice in the dark. Give me a moment. I'll let you know where I'm coming from. My mother's name is Stella August. She had once told me that the name of my father was Robert Plum, and I'm assuming you're this person. And his answer was, yes, I am.
Bill also went on his own search, and he decided that the only way he was going to understand who he was, and after so many years of growing up white, was to work for his own people.
I started to examine, talk to elders. I went and sought out Indian elders and talked to them and tried to find out about the historic and the spiritualism of our people. And I read books, lots of books, and so that was a sort of a roots journey of my own that I had to take. I had to take that journey and find out where that would lead me. One of the ways I did that is in, well, I guess the early 70s, I accepted a job with a Native organization, OMSIA, Ontario Métis and Non-Status Indian Association, as their housing director, and that was part of that journey.
The placement of Aboriginal children in residential schools, alcohol abuse, the disadvantaged economic situation experienced by many Aboriginal people, and the cultural misunderstanding explain in part why there are so many Aboriginal children in foster care. But let us not forget that Aboriginal people have historically been and continue to be the objects of policies of colonization. And until this is recognized, acknowledged, and a process of decolonization takes place, experiences like Diane's, Jeanette's, and Bill's will continue. For their part, these three are attempting to stop the cycle. Bill believes that the Anishinaabe Health Center is indeed a form of self-government and that taking care of their own people is the only solution. Diane is doing her own work for Aboriginal people now and just recently coordinated a constitutional congress for the Native Council of Canada. Jeanette is enrolled at Carleton University's social work program and is doing everything she can to help her people heal.
Oh, I think it's going to take many years, and there may be some of us who will not sort of ever get that healing, just because our experiences have been so bitter. And I can remember one Indian woman who was a registered nurse and a fine lady who right in front of the Minister of Health in Ottawa turned around and said to the Minister of Health, I hate you, and I hate you because you're white. And that was because she was sent to residential school and she was horribly abused, and physically, mentally, sexually. And she said, listen, she said, my kids don't feel the way I do. So they won't hate you, or they won't hate white people. She said, but I do, and I can't help it. She said, I got a university degree. I'm a nurse. I know that it's not, it doesn't make sense when I think about it logically, but that's the way I feel. So I think there's a lot of people who the best we can do is some kind of damage control and help them as best we can, and hope that future generations are better off. And I firmly believe that self-government is really the answer.
I wanted to be so much on Native issues because this, to me, is where I belong. And then I met at the Congress, I mean, Native people from across the nation. I mean, different tribes and tribes that I didn't even know existed, and I'm sure I don't know all of them. I've got lots to learn, still some more. And I've met youth. I met one person in particular, Jeanette, which we'll be talking to. And Jeanette has influenced me a lot. Oh, there goes the tissue. Don't be afraid. That's Jeanette. Jeanette too went through lots of hardships, but she gave me the strength. Don't be afraid. Go and get what you want. Sorry. And when I did the Congress, it was like all these people. They are mine. They were my people, and nobody can touch me anymore.
I, as an Aboriginal young person, will do all that I can so that history does not repeat itself. It is the time for Aboriginal people to reclaim themselves. To me, I'm waking up to my culture. I'm rubbing the sleep from my eyes. And here I am. Nothing's been lost. Nothing's been taken away. I'm just waking up. And I'm smelling the coffee, and I'm getting my act together. I'm getting focused. As long as our children are on the street, as long as our people are in jail, as long as our children are being taken away from their families and put into white foster homes, and no connection to their family, you'll see me out there giving people a rough time.
That's our program for this week. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dale Montour, Onigiwahi, Zego de Dese.